I've lived with haemophilia for 25 years and have had to cope with all the problems that entails. Before the AIDS virus came along, I thought that I would otherwise be able to have what could pass for a normal life in terms of marriage and children. But now, I don't know what the future is.
Until recently, Julian Miller enjoyed a promising career in advertising, but now his days are spent here in the beautiful Pennant Valley in North Wales. As a haemophiliac who's contracted the AIDS virus, he and fellow sufferers are often regarded with fear and suspicion. Very few of them are prepared to speak publicly about the virus, which has no respect for person or class, but Julian is one who is.
It's a very, very nice place to live. I'm very lucky, but it's my only option. I have nowhere else to go. Obviously, it's quite difficult moving around anyway, for me, and to be stuck up the end of a Welsh valley it's like being in quarantine.
But then I suppose you're luckier than some haemophiliacs in the same position as you.
Yes, much luckier, because I have the support of a very loving family whose attitude and help has been of invaluable assistance to me in all that I have been able to do throughout my life.
Does it help that you're comfortably off too?
Obviously, every day, day to day, it does. It takes the edge off some of the slightly more unpleasant things. But all in all, it's irrelevant to my own wish to be independent and to have a life of my own. And it's just a question of attitude. The money is irrelevant.
What is the attitude then?
The attitude is strength, and that we won't let this beat us, and that obviously within my constraints I will try and do everything that I possibly can. And I have fought for that, and my parents and brothers have fought for that very strongly too.
Julian has returned to his parents' home near Bala after leading a campaign to get compensation for haemophiliacs who contracted AIDS as a result of NHS treatment.
Being a haemophiliac is very limiting. I tend to hemorrhage. I bleed into my joints, which inflames them, makes them very painful, and consequently limits my mobility. I cannot walk very far. The bleeding itself is internal and can last quite a long time. I treat this with a preparation called Factor VIII, which I inject myself. The secondary damage caused by the bleeding is, if anything, worse, which is the arthritis that is brought to the joints through the bleeding episodes. And this causes deformation of limbs and reduced mobility and reduced travel.
So would you say you've always had to face up to a restricted lifestyle?
Oh, very much so. Ever since I was a child, I was in wheelchairs quite a lot of the time. I could never join in any of the sports. I've always been very much limited, and not to knock myself, not to overdo it, to be quiet and careful.
Julian is one of 1,200 British haemophiliacs who've contracted AIDS through injections of the blood clotting agent known as Factor VIII. This vital treatment is given to prevent crippling arthritis, and having helped to improve his life so dramatically, it was a bitter blow to discover that Factor VIII could also spell death.
In about 1984, we were told that Factor VIII, which had come from America because various governments had not had the will, nor the ability, nor the money to make this country self-sufficient in Factor VIII, that we were told that there was a danger that our Factor VIII was contaminated with the AIDS virus, or which, as is known, the HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. We were told that we should carry on taking the Factor VIII, despite this, what was called then a slight risk, because we were far more likely to receive health-threatening or life-threatening damage from not taking the Factor VIII than we were from infection of the HIV virus.
And how did you find out that you were HIV positive?
The threat, or the likelihood that many haemophiliacs were infected, came to light increasingly as more tests were done and more was found out about the virus itself. I found out through a routine blood test at my haemophilia centre in Oxford, and was told in October 1984 that I was HIV positive.
AIDS has become a major concern for the National Blood Transfusion Service. As well as discouraging those in the high-risk groups from giving blood, the service also now screens every donation for the AIDS virus. Here in Wales, there are about 50 haemophiliacs who are HIV positive. None of these are known to have the full-blown disease at present, but so far, 5 have died from the illness. The fact that they contracted the virus from life-saving treatment has been described as the biggest tragedy in the history of the NHS.
It was in the early 1980s. The first hint of it came when people who were given straightforward blood transfusions in the United States were found to have developed AIDS, and it was then traced back to donations from people who themselves subsequently developed AIDS, and then became the important link between an infected donor and a patient who subsequently developed the AIDS infection. After that, it was realized that some patients with haemophilia also acquired AIDS virus infection, and the link was established quite clearly between infected donors and recipients of blood or recipients of blood products.
Factor VIII is purified from the blood of large numbers of donors, and the only effective way of destroying the AIDS virus is to heat-treat donations. This is now routine procedure, but it's not a straightforward process.
We know that when we collect the blood and we process it in the laboratory, we have to treat it very carefully to preserve the delicate material. If we don't do that, it decays and there isn't any active chemical left to treat the patients with haemophilia. Heat treatment of the factor VIII molecule had to be tailored precisely so that it wouldn't damage the factor VIII molecule and yet at the same time would inactivate the virus. This wasn't something which could be developed overnight. It took obviously an extensive period of laboratory testing to arrive at that.
Julian Miller uses 6 containers of factor VIII like this every week. The blood of several thousand donors is needed to produce the plasma in each bottle. So what are the chances of factor VIII becoming infected with AIDS in future?
Obviously no one can give 100% guarantees. It's only been about 2 years since the heat-treated, purified factor VIII has been available, but the experience so far has shown that it's an extremely good product. It's effective therapeutically in treating the blood clotting disorder, and it's also been shown not to have viable AIDS virus. So we're very confident that this has solved the problem of transmission of the AIDS virus.
Sadly, this reassurance comes too late for haemophiliacs like Julian, who've already got AIDS.
I came home the day I discovered I had the HIV virus, that I was HIV positive, and nothing was said. Arms were not thrown up in the air, and there was no screaming and ranting and crying. But the news was taken quietly and calmly. And then the next morning, my father came downstairs and said, "Your mother was crying all night," which in fact was the first time it came home to me, because it was affecting people around me, that it was something that was very nasty indeed and potentially deathly.
Home and family have become increasingly important to Julian since his haemophilia forced him to give up his job. His mother's attitude to this long-term disabling illness had always been positive, but the prospect of AIDS was devastating.
He'd been through so much. How old was he? 22? And, you know, we'd all fought so hard, and he'd fought so hard, and then it was a sort of extra kick in the teeth that we felt we didn't need.
Julian seems very positive and an optimist. Are you still optimistic?
Very, yes, very. He's strong and he's healthy and he's lived a very healthy life, and hopefully, you know, the statistics show one thing one minute and another thing the next. So we will look on the good side and hope that that'll sustain him. till they find something.
Originally, we were told that there was estimated to be a 20% chance of developing the full AIDS syndrome. So 1 in 5 haemophiliacs would develop it, and if you develop it, you die. A recent survey by one of the leading haemophilia doctors has now estimated that that might rise to 80%. So it's getting worse. Further to that, there is also now evidence that the AIDS virus has an ability to change its shape and to mutate, so that any attempts or any success in finding a cure for the virus or finding a vaccine might be invalidated at a later date if it changes its shape. It's similar, I believe, to the common cold virus, which is very difficult to pin down.
Julian was about 6 months old when his severe haemophilia was diagnosed, but as the third son in a family with no history of the condition, he was always encouraged to lead as normal a life as possible and hope for a career like his brothers.
I would like to be independent like any 25-year-old. This is not possible. It places a great strain on the rest of the family. And, of course, it places a great strain on me. I'd much rather be a free agent, but obviously that'll be tricky because of my physical limitations. What has helped overall is their attitude to this situation, that they have made great sacrifices and compromises in their life to make mine easier and better. There are days when I'm down, and then the family rallies round. I mean, it's only recently that I've realised that what an effect it has on them too, that they see me depressed, and obviously it affects them. We don't talk about that, but I know it's there.
He can't sort of have a normal life and, I suppose, get married and have family and make his own life. He's really sort of stuck with us.
And does that pose a strain?
No, because we love having him and we'd miss him terribly if he, if he did leave home as one does. But it's not necessarily good for him. There's no alternative.
And what keeps you going on days where you do get low and depressed about it?
He does. He's the one.
I have to put out of my mind thoughts of social interrelationships with the opposite sex, marriage, children, and that really means most to me from my point of view, because being unable to do so many things, that was one of the things that would obviously have been highly fulfilling.
What about relationships, though? I mean, do you actively avoid meeting women, or,
No, funnily enough, not. Obviously, in my particular situation at the moment, I don't meet a great many. But I've learnt over the time that I've been HIV positive, in fact, that aspect is really my problem. It's my problem if I cannot relate to women. And in fact, I now realise that whilst it would take quite a remarkable woman to take me on, that is not impossible. So I haven't shut the door on that one at all, not finally, no.
Julian's eldest brother, Clooney, is married and now lives in Portugal. But 29-year-old Rupert runs a fish-smoking business from the family home.
I suppose every young man or woman aspires to some dream, whether it be small or large, or however ambitious they may be. And Julian at 22 had just about got to the stage where he could actually cope with haemophilia. When the AIDS thing struck him, I think his initial dreams must have been shattered, and obviously had a great effect on us all.
What are your hopes for him for the future?
My hopes for Julian for the future are very simple. that he finds a smashing girl who will take him on.
It's difficult keeping anything secret for long in a small rural community. So when Julian appeared on TV, identified as an AIDS victim, he must have been worried about the reception he'd get back home.
Everybody in the village must know by now that I am HIV positive. And despite that, I have had no comeback from them at all. If they've been anything, they've been supportive.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can I help you?
Yes, please. Could I have £5 of your homemade Cumberland sausages, please?
Yes, certainly. Where did you get the recipe? It's a secret recipe. I had it off a friend of mine. I can't divulge the source.
But I have heard that some haemophiliacs have not even told members of their own family, which I can also understand because a lot of damage has been done to the AIDS cause, in my belief, by the way that it has been reported in an alarmist way in some of the tabloid newspapers.
In an attempt to redress the balance and give the public the true facts about AIDS, the government spent £14 million last year on its Don't Die of Ignorance campaign. But in spite of the national TV and press exposure and leaflets delivered to every home in the country, Julian feels that much of the ignorance about AIDS remains, with prejudice still close to the surface.
Whilst the government AIDS Don't Die of Ignorance campaign is national, it doesn't reach people in the heart, in their own homes. And I think until the vast majority of people know someone with the virus, barriers will still be there. But when it's touched everybody's lives a little bit, as it will, because the figures are alarming for the growth rate in AIDS sufferers, when it begins to touch everybody's life in some way, when they know a cousin of an aunt of whoever who's had it, then that'll do something to break it down, to break down the prejudice and bigotry.
Julian's contribution to breaking down that bigotry was to lend his support to the recent Haemophilia Society campaign to get compensation for AIDS sufferers who'd contracted the virus as a result of their NHS treatment. Unable to get mortgages or life cover, HIV-positive haemophiliacs and their families often find themselves in serious financial difficulties.
The Haemophilia Society was obviously very keen to push home its case that the government, in a caring society, should recognise a moral duty to help a badly disadvantaged group of people who had, not through no fault of their own, but through no direct action of their own, been infected with a horrific AIDS virus.
The argument was powerful enough to win the support of MP Chris Butler, who felt that haemophiliacs had received a horrible death sentence at the hands of the state, albeit unwittingly.
I have very great sympathy with them indeed, but I think the first thing to do was to get the government to recognise the principle of the matter. That was vitally important. And my comparison was always with the vaccine-damaged children. Now, in that case, it took years of pressure for a government to recognise that it had a moral responsibility of vaccine-damaged children. They get about £20,000, I believe. That's what the payout is. So, in fact, in this case, the interval between the campaign really getting going on behalf of the haemophiliacs and the government actually coming up with something was very short indeed. It was only a matter of weeks. And I was quite surprised about the responsiveness of the government to this particular campaign.
Julian Miller was the public face of that campaign, and unlike most people in his position, he made a feature of his plight to gain support.
In my work, I'd been operating at quite a sophisticated level, mostly at boardroom level, talking to people, directors, chairmen and managing directors of companies, and making presentations, standing up all on my own in front of large groups of people talking. So yes, it gave me great confidence to go forward and deal with the media and the press.
Was it really like selling a product?
In some ways, yes, because, of course, we were trying to sell the idea and the facts of the terrible plight that haemophiliacs are in. Obviously, in my background as working for an advertising agency, I had been talking to people about selling products more, but certainly some of the techniques used are the same.
You didn't ever once think, why am I putting myself on the line like this?
Of course, that goes across, came across my mind, certainly, but I was very, very keen firstly, to do everything I could to help, and secondly, to use what skills I had learned in the advertising world to help the Haemophilia Society in its quest for compensation.
It took less than a month for the government to respond, not offering compensation, but instead a £10 million grant to set up a trust fund for those in need. At the Haemophilia Society's London headquarters, officials are working overtime to get that fund up and running.
David,
Hello, nice to see you, Julian.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Good.
No doubt you want to know how the trust's going.
Yes, how's it going?
A lot's happened since we last saw each other. We're progressing towards establishing the trust, approaching people about becoming trustees of the trust, and looking at ways in which we can invest and get the best possible return on the money from the first moment we receive it through to the grants being made.
Mm. While the Society was obviously delighted at the speed of the government's response, some of its supporters were worried that the money wouldn't be enough in the long term.
I think we all knew that £10 million was not enough to do the job that we wanted to do, but we had achieved special recognition, and with any government that is good. With our present government it is excellent.
Could you not have held out for more, though?
There was no more on the table. There was no bargaining point. We were in a position of take it or leave it, and I don't think we would have done haemophilia, the Haemophilia Society, or our public relations any good if we had simply refused it.
One MP pointed out that afternoon that it was a great burden of responsibility on a society as small as yours, with such a tiny staff, to administer such a huge amount of money.
We're a very small organisation. We've only got 4 full-time staff and some part-time staff, and it is a huge burden of responsibility. And since the announcement was made, we have spent some time sorting out various issues with the government in relation to the administration of the trust.
How important a role do you think Julian Miller played in the success of the campaign?
An absolutely crucial role. Without the 1 or 2 wonderful people who were happy to come forward and have their haemophilia and their HIV status disclosed on television, in the newspapers and through the media, the campaign would never have got anywhere, because the thing that affected ministers and members of Parliament most was being able to put a face to the problem, and that's what Julian enabled us to do in a way that was new and fresh and exciting.
You're well? You've been well since I last saw you?
Yes, very well, thank you.
Let's talk about your general health.
Ironically, Julian hopes that he'll never have to call on the fund for help. Meanwhile, his doctor at Oxford's Haemophilia Centre has some reservations about the way the fund will operate.
The main pitfall I see is going to be the web of documentation form filling to get at the money. The patient will have to, in the first place, prove he is a haemophiliac in some fashion, prove that he is anti-HIV positive in some fashion, and then have his need assessed by someone. Now, I suspect that someone will be the Haemophilia Centre directors who will have this task to do, and they will have to make difficult decisions, because it isn't all that much money, really, when you're thinking about 1,200, 1,500 haemophiliacs who are antibody positive. There is still a lot, despite all of the campaigns, the campaigns by the government and the campaigns in the press, there is still a lot of ignorance about what HIV infection means. People still will not distinguish between the person who has AIDS and the person who is antibody positive. They assume that every haemophiliac, for instance, has AIDS. And this has caused problems for the patients at school, when they're little boys, at work, and in their social lives. Julian has had little in the way of discrimination against him, and he's rare in his experience. Partly that's Julian, of course, his attitudes as such. He's an outgoing person, and he goes to meet the problem. And probably that is the way to educate the public, of course, to go out and meet it.
Anger and bitterness are hollow emotions that don't do anybody any good. It's very sad, and me getting angry or being bitter is not going to help me cope with this. There are certain haemophiliacs who have taken legal action against the government, and this is obviously one way of venting your anger. I personally find it very difficult to be castigating of the government. We have the best treatment, I believe, of any haemophiliacs in the world. I find it very difficult morally to bite the hand that feeds me.
But is there no anger or bitterness about the fact that his college contemporaries are now enjoying well-paid, satisfying jobs, while AIDS has forced him to lower his expectations and settle for so much less?
I don't feel anymore that I have to compete. I don't feel jealous or resentful or envious of any of my friends, because they've made their choice within their abilities, and there is no point in me what-ifing, so to speak, because I have to make the best of what I've got to make life livable now. And so you have to think like that, otherwise you go into self-destruct, and there's no future in that. The hills and the mountains produce a very, very conducive atmosphere to melancholy, so I have to I have to guard against that. And sometimes when the clouds come in and sit on top of the mountains, it's very tempting to mirror that with depression. But when the sun shines or there's fresh snow, it's the most beautiful part of the world for me.
These beautiful surroundings, then, may have helped Julian to put his life in perspective. But he knows that no amount of money or comfort can change his uncertain future, with the deadly AIDS virus hidden in his bloodstream like a time bomb.
The best scenario is that I will go on surviving, living, until they find a cure. Now, estimates vary between 7 and 10, 15, 20 years before they find a cure. The virus sits in your body waiting to strike, rather like a vulture on your shoulder, and can remain incubating for a complete lifetime, they believe. That could be the best. The worst is that I develop the first signs of the AIDS syndrome tomorrow, which might be radical loss of weight, sweating, thrush, and then it goes on to pneumonia, various kinds of cancer, and then death in anything from 3 months to over 2 years. So that's the worst.
And what are your hopes for the future? Is there anywhere in between that you have set your sights on?
No, I just live every day for every day and get as much pleasure out of every day as I can.